Hello and welcome to the Tea Leaves Podcast, where we sit down to have an ongoing conversation on the Indo-Pacific century, brought to you by the Asia Group. Hello, I'm Kurt Campbell.
And I'm Rich Verma. Each episode will bring you into the discussion with the most prominent policymakers, artists, journalists, business, and thought leaders.
And today we're really thrilled to have a good friend, Piper Stover, with us in studio. She's got very significant experience working at the intersection of business, technology, and China. Currently, Piper is the CEO and co-founder of Bank Technologies. It's an early-stage technology company focused on developing artificial intelligence and biological products for the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and new materials industries. Man, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, we're simplifying it.
And also, guys, few people I know have had more interesting on-the-ground experience in China and perspectives on where the complexities of the U.S.-China business relationship are heading. So over to you, Piper.
Well, thank you, Kurt and Rich, for having me today. To start, how did I get to China? I think, I started very young after Middlebury College and learning Chinese at the language training school.
Can I just pause right there and ask you why Middlebury and why Chinese?
Middlebury for the language training.
Okay.
Also Vermont. My dad went to Dartmouth, and he would bring his fraternity brothers up to Vermont to ski in the winters. And so as a youngster, I went up there every winter, and we had wonderful winter carnivals with all of the family. So loved Vermont always.
But how did you know you wanted to study Chinese?
So that was back to my hometown in Cazenovia, New York, near Colgate and Cornell, that area outside of Syracuse, where very small town, one Chinese family, a chef, an amazing, exquisite Chinese chef, and I became her, right-hand prepper for catered parties that we would have, that was for me, it was the attraction to the culture and the people, the warmth of this woman who had left Guangzhou in the early days. And
how did she feel being the lone Chinese person in this New York village?
Everybody loved this family. This family was gracious. I mean, this is where the culture, the Chinese and the Americans, in my opinion, actually, there's a lot of similarities and a lot of warmth among how families work together, especially in this conservative town of Cazenovia where I grew up. So, yeah, she was endeared, and I loved just working with them and laughing and giggling. I can just remember her always laughing in the kitchen. We just had a great time.
This does remind me, honestly, a little bit of my own family's experience as my mother and father being the first Indian family in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and how my mother was so kind of warmly received by all of her neighbors and friends, and had a big impact on people. It was mutual, but it's such a great story that you tell. And this woman had such influence on you that you wanted to go off and study and learn more about China.
Mm-hmm. But she spoke Cantonese. Her sons never actually learned Mandarin Chinese very fluently. She helped name me and used Cantonese to call me my name. So when I came back and was bilingual, it was funny to chat with her and to have her try to speak broken Mandarin Chinese or Putonghua.
So what happens after Middlebury?
So after Middlebury, I went, pretty much straight to Washington, D.C., and that's when I first got my job on K Street with a trade law firm and worked China, Japan client cases, and then that ended up working at the U.S.-China Business Council soon after that, meeting the crew that was doing a lot of the trade work.
And then about a decade on the ground in China in various capacities.
Yeah, moved back to China quickly and started to, help run that office, and that was the heyday of growth in the 90s. So it worked mostly tech sectors and some of the pharmaceutical companies early on then. But this was just when telecom was starting. I mean, we were just starting to use the internet to communicate in the mid 90s.
Part of the reason it's so good to have Piper here is that China is dominating the policy discussion in Washington, and China and technology in America is dominating the discussion. But so few people talking about these issues have actually lived and worked in China on technology issues for a decade. And so we get caught up in all of this incredible hype and momentum to conflict and containment and Cold War. And I just wonder if you can just shed a little light on what's really going on, how concerned should we be? And I'm really talking about kind of what you saw where China's headed on the tech front.
Sure.
Big questions, but maybe you can unpack it a little bit.
So the early days in the 90s, this is when AT&T, the telecom companies were just really starting to try to create the right policies for everybody to use systems then. And it was all open, lots of mutual interest in one another's perspectives and viewpoints, a welcoming of technology. And let's learn from each other, and a welcoming on both sides. And of course, some lobbying on both sides. But I think now, and particularly as I started to really be interested in maybe coming back to the United States, the doors were starting to close. I was no longer, as a senior representative of a large tech company, welcome into meetings that I previously had always been welcome to. Certain buildings couldn't even go near that I had gone to before. Kind of a distrust among staff in various offices, including in my own. Certainly the very bonded relationships last, but there was just a discomfort. And so because I was really familiar with the technology sector, I was probably feeling it more than some of the other consumer-driven industries that were not in that same space. So that became a problem for me.
Piper, a lot of the concerns have been about, and this is where we have to unpack this a little bit, about theft of U.S. technologies, about forced kind of technology transfer, lack of IP protections. And a lot of that is for commercial reasons, but I assume also a lot of it is for kind of more nefarious or security reasons as well. But again, I'm trying to get your sense of, no kidding, this is serious. We should be really worried about what's happening. Or is there a in-between that we should be thinking about?
Well, I don't know what you want me to say, but I will say what I feel, which is, and think based on my own experiences, which I think we are at a very serious level. And I would only say that because the national plans, and this is particularly the 13th five-year plan, is earmarked to go after all of the strategic areas, highest tech areas that are the same types of areas that we would want to continue to be world leaders. So, there's a direct competitive threat backed by real state money and state-backed enterprises that are focused on the very areas where we have private sector companies that aren't necessarily as supported by our own government. So I think that's a concern.
So Piper, building on Rich's questions, but I'd like to ask maybe a more human kind of dimension of this. So you've lived and studied. When I first met you in the 1990s, you knew more about China than almost any person I had worked with. And you've got decades of experience now working with Chinese people. How are their attitudes towards the United States evolving? I know you can't generalize a country of billions of people, but how do you think about that? So from what your experience is there more distrust? Is there a hardening of views? Do you find that people are more wary of speaking because of concerns of the state? What do you observe from your long experience?
So again, I think it's really important not to just group everybody in one camp. Diversity in China is really important to remember. You have all sorts of people with all sorts of backgrounds. And I'm friends with all sorts of these backgrounds. These friends range from, party members to activists. And that's a good way to be, I think. But I would say that very recently, my friends and contacts are concerned. They are concerned about their own country and government and changes happening, in the party at the top levels. Many of them are trying to leave, and you can have real conversations with them when they are out of the country, of course. And I would say their viewpoint on America, they'll admit as soon as they're out of the country, they're self-aware enough, many of them, to know that they're reading propaganda, state-corrected news and publication and positions about what the citizens ought to be thinking. But those who aren't as well educated, will read the state press and feel genuinely in agreement with what's coming out of the press. And there's a real resilience, I think, to the Chinese people. They can, there's a saying, 吃苦, which is to eat bitterness. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese are just so much better than we are at sustaining and withstanding difficult times. And so I think that's the grit factor. They can go through a lot worse than I think the typical American or Westerner can go through. And so, they take the news and what they're seeing with a grain of salt, because if their means of survival and their living standards are good enough, then they're not going to complain too much. I think what the concern is, if the Chinese government, if you're going to grade performance like a report card, and it's maybe a C right now, I was talking to Chinese friends, if they're going into a C minus D area, you're going to start to see and hear more concerns. And I think we're actually headed in that direction based on the conversations and the feedback I'm getting from my colleagues.
How much of this do you attribute to there's a big debate in the United States, as you know, Piper, about how much of this is about Xi Jinping, how much is it about the Communist Party, how much is it about this is just an inexorable dimension of a great power rising that has confidence or a belief in its own system competing with our own. How do you answer that complex question?
Well, again, I think you can't really say it's the Communist Party, because even in the Communist Party, you have factions. And those factions we often don't see; those are very secret. But and so it's hard to read the tea leaves of some of the things that are printed intentionally or unintentionally in various different publications. So I would say that my own experience, when President Xi came to power, it was a clear difference in the way the policies were affecting not only foreign companies, but domestic companies as well. So even a Chinese private company, and of course I went back to China after having children in 2010-11 period. And, I was working in a startup, a Chinese, American, European, very interesting platform startup. And it was so difficult to allow for the small Chinese companies to get loans and start to really evolve or grow with an influx of venture capital and foreign talent and technologies, because the state was really starting to become much more supported under the new Xi Jinping policies and directives. And that was a clear departure from what was happening previously.
Are you surprised about where we are today in terms of the trade war, the mounting tensions? Did you see this coming when you were there or upon leaving?
I would say absolutely.
Really?
I would say absolutely.
Tell us why.
Well,
why?
I remember coming back, and I think I even had a quick chat with Kurt at one point. He probably looked at me like, "Wow, this woman's got to decompress," right?
Yeah, but for different reasons.
Well, all of the above, right? I think it's just a little too much for too long out there. I think you can see the signs when it's time to repatriate. But anyway, with some time and of course decompression, I look around and I see, and I'm just feeling like, yeah, this is what was going to happen, and quite frankly should. If you know anything about negotiating in China, on the streets, even in Chinese, it's a very emphatic and very dramatic affair. And, there's a time to walk away. And when you walk away and you really mean it, when you get to that price, you're just not going to pay anymore, and you just know your bottom line, you better be ready to walk away. And that's when you get the price. So you really have to know your bottom line and really be ready to walk away.
So do you think the last 2 years of trade turmoil has all been part of this kind of more theatrical, kind of performance, and both sides are eventually this will play out? Or is that what you were trying to?
So partisanship aside,
right, I
do believe that there is a bipartisan support for having a more hardline negotiating stance. And I believe that there has been good coming from a harder position, finally.
And on trade or on security issues brought more?
All of the above.
All of the above.
Because the trade issues were unbalanced. I mean, the asymmetry, what do you teach your kids when they're growing up? Find the asymmetry. You'll do well if you find the white space or the imbalance. We are in an asymmetrical relationship right now with the Chinese, and that's got to change. So trade war is not the answer. That's the first. That's the first step, and there needs to be a resolution to that. But what's the rest of the strategy? And that's. I
think there's a larger point, though, from my view, Piper. I think there's occasionally, Rich, a disagreement of what we're in the midst of. There is one group of people that think that we're in the midst of a complex negotiation about how we're going to coexist, and that has a trade, diplomatic, and that's one framework. And there are people in both Democrats and Republicans that believe that. There's probably another group that quietly believe actually what we're in is a profound competition that's really, and I know there can be overlap here, but that competition will only render winners and losers, and we've got to get ready to struggle and fight. And there may be some negotiation in that, but the dominant part of that is maneuvering for position. And I think that framework, that struggle, is likely to present itself in either a Republican or Democratic administration. Piper, do you disagree with that?
I would just say that is, I think what you've just said is critical, because does it have to be win-lose?
Yeah.
Right?
But do you think, so one of the things that I struggle with Chinese friends is, although they will sometimes talk about win-win solutions, my experience has been generally, they think mostly in relatively narrow win-lose.
Yeah, they like to say win-win.
Yeah.
But in effect, there's a wonderful film. Have you seen the film The Farewell? Lulu Wang?
No.
You've seen it, right? 别告诉他. It's a fabulous film. Please watch it with your family. You will, especially, I think, anyone with a family structure will really like this. But there's a scene in it where the bellhop is talking to the protagonist as she's going to this new hotel in the middle of nowhere to, get ready for this wedding with her grandmother who's got a stage 4 cancer in her lungs. Anyway, the bellhop is saying, how is America better than us? How are we better than America? Can you explain where are we winning and where are they losing? And the protagonist, Billy, basically just says, it's different. We're just different. Can't we just be different? Can we have a comparative advantage in different areas? Or do you have to be the best at everything? And I think that's a really important point to make about the relationship. And maybe something we could work on with the Chinese is, do you have to be the best in everything? Because, you see it when you're in China, even among the provinces, the competition is so intense among the domestic provinces. Everybody's trying to be the best aerospace leader. You can't. Every province cannot be the best aerospace. And they're dumping all this money into a comparative advantage that one province just doesn't have. So that is something to notice. So competition is big and you feel it. I have another friend who just told me actually last night that, it's so different now that she's living in the United States as a family member and a green card holder. She feels a relaxation because she's not in the competition of China, where there are 5 people trying to do the same thing as you, and you're always trying to make it. And it's a much more relaxing place to live in America, where you don't feel that same intense competition 24/7.
Right.
How does that compare with India, Rich?
Right?
My parents would be happy if I went to medical school tomorrow. So there is that sense of,
Getting
extreme,
ahead, right?
Competition kind of internally. And I did want to just ask you about the asymmetry point you mentioned. Where do you see the asymmetry playing out?
Well, from the business perspective, just the non-tariff barriers, right? So rules and regulations that foreign companies have to follow in China, but that the Chinese companies, private or state-owned enterprise, don't have to follow in our markets. Press, writing, freedoms of speech, same. You can't get, the Twitters and the Googles in China, but you can get the Baidu and the Alibaba here. So, these asymmetries in the marketplace are apparent.
Yeah. You spent a lot of time with American companies, either in trade associations or actually working with them. Do American companies, big American companies that have significant footprint in China, do they have alternatives? Can they pick up and walk away and go to Vietnam and Indonesia, India, if they are tired of this framework that they're living under right now?
Well, it depends on the investment, right? So if that return on investment is starting to dwindle and that their capital, footprint is not, it just depends on, looking at the balance sheet. But I would say that the one thing that was clear to me as I started to, really think about leaving again was that the investment requirement to expand in China, the requirement by the government was in the hundreds of millions or billions to establish a new factory, to have that market share promised, if you will, versus, a $10 million project in Vietnam that could be grown quickly without a lot of the constraints and bureaucracy that you were starting to face in China with, rising labor costs and costs in general for transportation, et cetera. That was starting to become apparent in the last few years that I was in China.
The challenge, though, Rich, is that most companies that made investments in China put a lot of money in China,
early on,
and have continued to sustain those investments. And you'd have to write off a lot to make a transition. And also just the recognition. I mean, China is more than 10 times bigger than Vietnam has 100 million people and is already reaching capacity in a lot of areas. And
Can't just show up there and find
there's an
factories.
absorption problem and they're overheating in some areas. So it's hugely challenging. And so most of the companies that we work with are looking to have shall we say, a diversity of options, remain in China, but also figure out other places. And they're starting to do that, but they look at all the contenders and, there's possibilities in India, but they have their own infrastructure challenges. Vietnam has done well in certain areas, but it's only so big. Other countries in Southeast Asia, not quite ready. Indonesia, right? So
it's Mexico. I know that we were talking aerospace, aviation, thinking the labor and the talent was possible to move to Mexico.
So do you think that just to build on some of the things, do you think that Chinese friends, do you think they understand that there has been a kind of awakening or at least a stop and let's reconsider elements of our relationship here in the United States over the last couple of years?
From within China or?
From within China, yeah.
It depends on the position of both administrations because there's some strange outlier activity going on in this administration too, in the United States that is making them pause for a minute as well. So it's everybody's a little just uneasy, I think.
Yeah.
So there's no decisions, I don't think, on either part in terms of the Laobaixing or the common people.
So Piper, you talked a lot about China and you your own experience in technology and the like. So you've come back to the United States and you decided that you want to go into this new arena. You tried to explain it to me a little while ago, and I'm still struggling with it. So maybe our listeners will be better prepared to sort of interpret. Give us a sense of what you're working on and the company you're leading, what you'd like to accomplish.
Sure. So while I was in China and worked with United Technologies Corporation and the Research Center, I had the opportunity to meet with a lot of different sectors doing research across a lot of different industries. And I did come across kind of a convergence between artificial intelligence and artificial cells. And there's a new trend in what you'd call synthetic biology to understand what makes a living system. So the fact that we've got artificial intelligence that can do all sorts of things, especially considering, say 15, 20 years ago, we probably never would have thought we would be wearing artificial intelligence and be able to talk on our telephones or have, Siri in our houses and Google Home. I mean, the things that have happened in the last 15 years, people would have thought were crazy back then. Well, I'm in a spot that is seeming crazy to people. But frankly, BINC, BioInfo, NanoCogno, a very small nanoscale or kind of molecular level understanding using artificial intelligence to work with living lifelike systems to do incredible things in the future, like self-repair. Or, do we really need to have plastic anymore? Wouldn't it be great if we could actually create a molecular structure that was renewable, but that could form a container that would replace plastics? Or even take plastics and digest plastics. Take carbon out of the air to bind molecules to carbon to reduce through a biomineralization on rocks that could actually, by order of magnitude, attract carbon out of the air.
How far are we away from some of those?
Lifelike systems, 5 to 7 years max. You've got people all over. And this is really, really interesting because I look at the government spending for synthetic cell development. I look at China, and recently, just this past year, Shenzhen, they're putting a $26 billion effort into Shenzhen to just focus on synthetic biology and these lifelike systems that will be doing the things that I've just talked about in about 10 years max. But, along that way, there are going to be developments and IP opportunities to create, new sensors, new types of lab equipment, health applications, taking the artificial intelligence and working with things like organoids or organelles to test therapies rather than on humans or animals. You can actually do it in a chip. So all sorts of very small technologies that we can't really get our head around, but that scientists have been working on for the last 20 years. I mean, my co-founder worked at Los Alamos for 20 years and has been working on lifelike systems for that long. And only now are we starting to see, we could actually make something useful for customers in the pharma or biotech sectors or the chemical sectors where we, again, back to the plastics point, or new energies. We could do things that aren't going to be depleting our biosphere the way that you see in the movie WALL-E. I don't know if you remember that movie if you had kids 15 years ago, but I don't really want to live on an Earth that looks like what we saw in WALL-E. So this is an effort to figure out, let's change up. And so the systems that are going to be disruptive in about 5 to 10 years is the area, the emerging frontier tech that I'm working on right now.
That's super cool. I want to try to maybe summarize where we've been in this conversation. And you're someone who has this incredible, I don't want to overstate it, but kind of love of Chinese culture and people. I see your kids speak the language.
Right.
You live there. But what's interesting is you also, and again, I don't want to characterize your views too much, but you have a harder line edge as well on some of the policy issues, security issues, trade issues, and economic issues. Does that make you optimistic about the future between the U.S. and China, pessimistic, somewhere in between? Just give a sense of where we're headed, because I was a little surprised by your tougher
hard line. I know.
Hard line. It's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I think the fear I have is, what do you do with all of the artificial intelligence and the data and the ability to centralize the collection and manipulation of that data? Who's behind the curtain? I think that's the concern. Not having checks and balances in a system like China is the biggest threat that we have. And again, people are people, right? You get them in this, which is why people-to-people exchanges are so important. You get people in front of each other and actually have a real conversation without the propaganda and the scripts. We're all humans. We can figure things out. But when you start to control people's movements with the social credit score in China, for example, by saying something that is anti-government or, look what's happening with Hong Kong and Xinjiang, it's very frightening to me. And I think that's the biggest threat we have right now.
Piper, that's terrific. Can I just ask this last thing? As this new area of technology you're talking about, so who are the likely winners in the United States? Who's making the investments now? So like what we saw with IT is a group of people, some from almost nowhere, right? Garage and stuff like that have now become dominant players in either, software or social media and like, where will the dominant folks that are working in this arena, where are they going to emerge from? Universities, research parks, larger biotech firms? What are we likely to see?
Well, I think you have some famous names already in synthetic biology of Craig Venter, the Genome Project, and George Church, but they're coming at it from a different perspective. They're coming at lifelike systems from, working and tweaking with existing biological structures where, some of the really interesting work happening at the physics and chemistry levels, the non-organic levels, which is where I'm playing, they're in the universities right now, and that's basic research. So it's going to be coming out of the basic research and so moving into applied research and finding ways to fund that development. That's the space where it's going to be exciting. And so I would, I am keeping close with several young scientists who are sort of the proteges of the folks that I call the space cowboys, who I'm working with right now, where I think that we'll be able to bring them out of the universities and work with them in very, within the next couple of years.
That's fascinating, Piper. You've had such an interesting career. I think Rich and I, our whole team, wish you well in this new venture. And really, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And again, wish you the best.
And thank you to our listeners. Please be sure to rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Piper, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you both.
And we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Rich.